So, as I mentioned before, these reactions with HX always give us substitution. And the primary would do SN2 because primary alcohols cannot form stable carbocations. And secondly, the conjugate base, or X minus, is a good nucleophile, whether it's bromide, iodide, or chloride. And good nucleophiles, of course, increase the rate of SN2 reactions. Right? If it was tertiary with HX, then it would do SN1. And this was because tertiary was too hindered for SN2, or you can form a stable carbocation. And the nucleophile strength doesn't matter if the nucleophile is not attacking during the rate limiting step. So these tertiary alcohols undergo SN1 faster than SN2. As I mentioned, though, secondary is a mess, right? Both SN1 and SN2 are possible, but neither of them is fast.